Hey yo, that worked pretty well. Okie dokie, alright, we're gonna get warmed up. I'm not a very talkative person, I don't like talking very much. Alright, hello fellow internet dwellers. I'm gonna talk about my experience at the Amen Clinic because in the little bit of research I did, there's not very much information out there about what going to the Amen Clinic is like and what you'll get out of it. So I went in August of 2020 because I have a diagnosis of ADHD that has been sort of difficult to treat, and at the time I was 17, so I was still under the guidance of my parents, and my mom was sort of at her wit's end with my ADHD, and she thought, well, maybe going to this clinic that'll scan your brain will help figure out what maybe is actually wrong. And oh my god, the echo. I can hear the echo and it's driving me up the wall. So I went when I was 17, which is actually pretty late for somebody who's trying to figure out what's up with their brain and like if they actually have ADHD or not. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was either 7 or 8. Like, we've known about it for a long time, just medicine hasn't worked very well. You know, neurodivergence is a difficult thing to pin down. It's hard to treat, it's hard to medicate. It's very hard to put it in boxes, like what specifically is wrong with you, because different people have different issues, such as executive dysfunction is worse in some people than it is in others. I struggle with social skills and sounds, so my ADHD looks kind of weird, and that's just how it is. Compounding factors for having gone in August of 2020 is I had spent the entire summer in a basement with only my brother and living only with my family because of COVID. And I hadn't talked to any of my peers. Yikes. Before I went, they wanted like background information, so they made me take a battery of tests that tested my ability to focus, sustain focus, and be able to determine emotions of other faces. It was like a whole list of things and a pretty typical psychological test apparently when it comes to like diagnosing things. I think I did that the week before I went up, and so then I went to the Amen Clinic in Chicago. It's a SPECT scan. It stands for single photon emission computed tomography. It's kind of like a PET scan in that more blood will flow to areas that are in use, so like cancer will require more blood, and that's why in a PET scan you can see cancer on it, because the concentration of that radioactive compound will be higher where there's more blood flow, so therefore where the cancer cells are. The SPECT scan's kind of like that. They put the ligand in you and then they watch the blood flow to the different areas of your brain, and from that determine how much you're using your brain and like using those different parts of the brain for different tasks. They gave me a dose of technetium bound to a ligand so that it would bind with different centers in my brain based on blood flow. And so the baseline was when they just gave it to me, and then I chilled for a bit and they scanned my brain. They didn't want me to be doing anything particularly, so that they could compare it with when I was concentrating on something, which I went in and did the next day. So I had 2 doses of technetium. Then I went in the next day and they asked me to focus on clicking X's, if I remember correctly, or like hitting the space bar every time an X came on screen, opposed to any other letter of the alphabet. And so that was like to test my concentration and to get my brain working, and then they would put me in the SPECT scan, and then based on that the blood flow in my brain would change because I had just been concentrating, and so then that showed up in the SPECT scan. So I got 2 scans, and it totaled to be about 2 scans and the battery of psych tests. And that totaled to be about $4,000, which is not covered by insurance. That's a lot of money. That's definitely something to consider if you're thinking about doing it. The day afterwards, I went back in to the clinic and didn't get any scan or anything. They just told me about my results. So they sat me down and showed me pictures of my brain while not concentrating and then while concentrating, and how the concentration of blood in my brain might indicate certain disorders or diseases. And then they gave me a document explaining what the different parts of your brain do and how increased or decreased blood flow may be indicative of certain psychological disorders. without getting into the weeds and explaining how the brain works, because it's rocky, like we don't know that very well. They said something along the lines of, based on that battery of psych tests and my SPECT scans, I likely had some sort of anxiety disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder. They said there was large indication that I had ADHD and autism and also depression, if I remember correctly. So I walked out of there with a lot of things that they thought was wrong with me, but something that they did not consider was the fact that I was doing this in the middle of a pandemic and had just started school back in person, but we were all wearing masks and I was like freaking out because I just could not take it. Socializing's hard if you don't do it for a long stretch of time. And so I'm pretty sure the depression and anxiety came from COVID and like COVID stress and the difficulty of school during COVID. Because I was just going into my senior year, just started my senior year in high school when I went and got this done. According to the battery of tests, like specifically that, there was moderate indication that I had ADHD, but like not that bad. Criticisms of SPECT scans include they're not very accurate. The resolution on mine was... Alright, so it stopped recording for some reason, but we're back. Okay, so criticisms of SPECT scans include that the resolution isn't very good. The pixel size on mine, like the resolution of my scan, was 2.46 millimeters, which might not sound large, but considering the fact that most of the areas of the brain are, well, at least the most sensitive ones, like the amygdala and the thalamus and the basal ganglia, and the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus are all like moderately sized. I am only 5'4". At the time, I don't think I had even reached that height. Listen, I don't care. Okay, most heads are too big for me, so I have a pretty small head. Resolution of 2.5 millimeters. It's not small. The technology was invented, I think, in the 90s, and obviously it's gotten better since then, but like SPECT scans specifically aren't the best. It's mostly because of the resolution. The thing is, it's really hard to use them on the brain because we don't quite know what all of the areas of the brain do. I mean, we don't even understand how cognition works right now. Our best guess is quantum mechanics, because the neurons firing, there's a lot of them up there. There's a lot of neurons, but there's not enough to justify the complex thought that humans can do. And so using a SPECT scan that can't even identify a small group of neurons firing is not going to give you the answers you need. It's a good estimate. It's good when you know there's brain damage. Dr. Amen is famous for doing scans on football players in the NFL and showing what their CTE affects and how that's going to change as they get older. That's a reasonable application of SPECT scans. There's SPECT machines all over the United States. Almost every hospital has one, according to Wikipedia. And they're not super duper expensive like PET scans are. And the radioactive ligand is less sensitive so that you have like a 6-hour window to use it instead of like a 1-hour window for a PET scan. And so using it for something like CTE or brain damage that you might not otherwise be able to get a good idea of, get a good picture of, that's reasonable because that's a physically based psychological condition. But it's really hard to prove that ADHD is something that you can pinpoint to specific physical deformities of a brain because everybody experiences it differently. Everyone's brains work differently. They fire nerves differently. Maybe my brain uses less blood because I'm an athlete and in shape, and then it looks like my ADHD isn't as severe as someone who isn't as in shape as I am because their brain uses more blood or their heart pumps more blood to everywhere than mine does. And then that's a confounding factor. And you'd think that by comparing it to a baseline, that might help get around it, but that's not necessarily the case. Even comparing it to your baseline from the day before is a bit rocky because you still can't identify specifically why your brain might be firing differently. Yeah, you can say that you're now concentrating and then that changed why your brain is firing, but correlation does not equal causation. You can't quite say that exactly. I remember thinking the entire time during my SPECT scan, my anxiety is gonna be, they're gonna think that I'm really anxious because I don't like needles And to give you the technetium ligand, they have to put an IV in you, and that scares the bejeepers out of me. I don't like IVs. And if I remember correctly, I had to be wearing a mask the whole time. And so I was like, they're gonna think that I'm just the most nervous, unsocial person known to man, simply because I don't like making eye contact when other people are wearing masks, and I don't like needles, and so that my nerves are gonna be like more than usual. Whereas if they were to have taken it when I was comfortable in my own home and not suffering from pandemic stress, my brain would look different. They didn't really consider that when they scanned my brain. I'm surprised that they did anything during the pandemic at all, simply because everybody was suffering from anxiety and depression. I mean, to an extent. Obviously, it's not clinical, but to an extent, because we had just had our entire lives upended and were walking around thinking, oh my God, am I going to die? And that's not something that they considered when they scanned my brain. There's a lot of articles out there by the New York Times and the Telegraph UK, for example, about why SPECT scans can't necessarily be used to determine psychological conditions, and why Daniel Amen is kind of just making a lot of money on this. And most psychologists think that it's not ethical to use SPECT scans to try and diagnose things because you end up over-diagnosing things. I have been evaluated a couple times just to try and figure out maybe is the ADHD something else, and most therapists and psychologists have come to determine that they don't think that I have anxiety and depression, and I don't think I do either. It just maybe kind of looks like it. Walking out of there with 4 diagnoses for all of these things that most people don't think are applicable to me, and then them saying maybe you should talk to your psychiatrist about this and getting medicated for that, it just seems suspicious. Because there is a lot of overdiagnosing that happens at the Amen Clinic, according to studies. And that's because people's brains work differently. Daniel Amen claims that what he uses SPECT scans for is just another piece of the puzzle in terms of trying to figure out what someone's anomaly might be. But it seemed like at the clinic when I went, and I didn't have Daniel Amen as my doctor was someone else, because I think he lives in California, and they have at least 6 Amen clinics across the United States. So my doctor was someone else, but it felt like my doctor relied more on the SPECT scan than the battery of psychological testing and my medical history. And they also did this thing called gene site testing, which is where they determine if you have any genetic indicators that you might have a disorder or something like that, or if you might have a sensitivity to specific medications or environmental factors. It kind of felt like those fell by the wayside, even though those are what I found to be most interesting, because it was something that has been peer-reviewed and studied by a bunch of different psychologists across the world and determined to be a reasonable means of diagnosing people, and B, those methods are widely agreed upon by the psychological community to be reputable and precise and accurate to the best that they can be. It's still not it's a really difficult science. So about Daniel Amen, he started out his career by getting a BA at Vanguard University of Southern California, which is a private religious school, and doesn't seem to have any large criticisms against it. But for his MD, he went to Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is also a private Christian school and has a handful of criticisms against it in terms of academic dishonesty and racism. And then he went on to do a stint at a couple military bases. And so he is technically licensed by the APA. So he's still a licensed psychologist focusing in child and adolescent psychology. But most colleagues think his methods are unethical because SPECT scans expose young people to excessive amounts of radiation, especially when you don't really get great answers out of them, and he charges a lot of money for them. Additionally, he has about 30 books written about different psychological disorders and why they may or may not be real, but they've all made it to New York Times best-selling list, so obviously they must not be complete shit. The Amen clinics also sell a line of supplements that claim to do a bunch of different things with your neurology. I actually was recommended a handful of these after I left, and I bought them and then took them and then told my psychologist at the time that I was taking them, and then she read the bottle, and it turned out the only proven active ingredients in the pills were just caffeine to help me focus. Everything else was just vitamins that I might have been missing from my diet and extracts from some plants. So it definitely was not proven by the FDA. They are not like medications. They're supplements. I just remember them being caffeine pills pretty much. And he makes a lot of money from those supplements and his books. My opinion is, if you have the money to spare and you're curious about what your brain might look like, and maybe getting another perspective as to what your psychological condition might be, I would say you could definitely go do it. It's just also important to consider the fact that it is not a very well proven science. He claims to have a bunch of articles published about why SPECT scans work, but the thing is that they're not in peer-reviewed journals, and academics that deal with adjacent or similar fields of psychology as Dr. Daniel Amen don't think that this is a good science and something that should be used as a method of diagnosing psychological disorders. But it was interesting to walk out of there knowing, wow, I just got my brain scanned. That's pretty cool. I know it's up there at least. The most helpful thing that came from going to the Amen clinics, not gonna lie, is the gene site testing, because then it helped me and my psychiatrist figure out which ADHD meds I should avoid because they just wouldn't work with my genes, or because I would process them too quickly because of my metabolism. So that was probably the most useful thing to come from my visit to the Amen clinic. But I would definitely say that if you are desperate for a diagnosis, go to a psychologist or go to a therapist, because the Amen clinics and SPECT scans are not going to tell you necessarily what you need to work on. And it's very difficult to design medicines that will target certain centers of the brain. It's an interesting piece to the puzzle that is your psychology, but it definitely did not help me decide what medications I should take and help me get diagnoses or support when I was in high school. And I think that the fact that Dr. Daniel Amen is a millionaire, if not billionaire, because of this technology and because of his supplement sales and his books, I think there's something unethical about that, because it's a pseudoscience. It's just there to help you feel better, maybe. It definitely seems like it's preying on desperate parents with children with a lot of things that are very hard to pin down, like high support autism. It feels like it's trying to convince those parents that maybe there is one last thing that could help them and their kids be normal. I think that's how my mother saw it. But I guess you should decide for yourself. I just thought I should toss this out there. Jazz hands.